Paradise, A History of Hawaii by James L. Haley. This book is read by Joe Barrett. To Jody and Leslie and Spencer and Kate. If a big wave comes in, large fishes will come from the dark ocean which you never saw before, and when they see the small fishes, they will eat them up. The ships of the white men have come, and smart people have arrived from the great countries which you have never seen before. They know our people are few in number and living in a small country. They will eat us up. David Amalo, advisor to King Kamehameha III. The nation that draws most from the earth and fabricates most and sells most to foreign nations must be and will be the greatest power on earth. This is to be looked for in the Pacific. William H. Seward, U.S. Secretary of State. Preface. Throughout recent years, activists agitating for the independence of Hawaii occupy the grounds of the Iolani Palace in Honolulu, the only former royal palace on American soil. They do this periodically. They want to draw attention to what, in their view, was the unconscionable way their country was annexed by the United States in 1898, in the name of cheap sugar and the needs of American imperialism, although, as we shall see, it was much more for the latter reason than the former. The full story of how the United States got its hands on the Kingdom of Hawaii is virtually unknown among the mainland general public, and I began this volume as a history of Hawaiian annexation. I quickly discovered, however, that such a narrow focus could not begin to embrace the kingdom's tumultuous journey, which ended with its absorption into the United States. Discovered by the British in 1778 as the most isolated and strategically important islands on Earth, the country endured the clash of empires as the British, French, Russians, Japanese, and Americans all contended for influence with the native monarchy. From the mayhem of civil war every time a king died, a preeminent conqueror arose, Kamehameha, who waged war and suppressed rebellion for 30 years before he could call himself master of all the islands in 1810. From a pre-contact culture of idol worship and human sacrifice, refugees from the Kamehameha conquest reached the United States, gained an education, insistently challenged American Christians to send missionaries to end the pagan terror, and in fact led the first missionaries back to their homeland. And then the struggle was on for the next 7 monarchs, to balance bringing their people into the industrial age while preserving for them some sense of cultural identity, to maintain the sovereignty of their country while dealing with the greediest and most powerful empires in the world, to provide a modern economy and wealth for their people while becoming snared ever tighter in the grip of the American economic colossus. For all this to have taken place in the span of one human lifetime is a pageant of imperial triumph and human tragedy rare, if not unknown, elsewhere in history. Dating back from annexation in 1898, the United States could never have captured Hawaii politically had it not first come to dominate the island's economy, and that moves the story back to the 1860s. Equally, it could not have dominated the economy without first capturing the people spiritually and culturally, and that moves the story back to 1820. But the American hand was felt even before that, in a bullying sea captain who inadvertently provided Kamehameha the technology needed to conquer the country, and in the mostly American traders who introduced the chiefs to luxury consumer goods and how to go into debt to acquire them. Annexation, then, can only be understood in this broader context of the Americanization of Hawaii. Oddly, there has never been a narrative history of Hawaii. There was a great deal of academic appraisal of the subject in the decades leading up to statehood in 1959, much of which has been reprinted for current reading, and James Michener's famous novel, Hawaiʻi, which rocketed him to literary stardom, came out in the very year of statehood. Modern academic studies have been rooted in the reigning politically correct paradigm of race, gender, and exploitation, which, as it turns out, are highly appropriate lenses through which to view the island's history. But the Hawaii I found is far more complex. Early in the process, I had coffee with a distinguished history professor friend of mine to discuss my possible return to graduate study, looking toward completing a long-abandoned PhD. He asked how my Hawaiʻi work was coming, and I said that while I was finding little to change my opinion that the 1893 overthrow was indefensible, I was also increasingly surprised and troubled by the pervasive oppression of the common people by their own chiefs and kings before Americans ever showed up. I cited several examples. The professor nodded and allowed that this was indeed the case, but he warned me that if I wrote the book that way and did not position the Hawaiians as victims of American racism and exploitation, as he said, it won't help you get accepted back into grad school. I marinated in this irony for a few moments and said, this must be what they mean by academic freedom. Noting my shock, the professor went on to say that race, gender, and exploitation have ruled the scholarly paradigm for 30 years and are entrenched for probably 30 more. He has made his peace with it, and he has disciplined himself to teach and write in that vocabulary. But it also seemed clear that when the actual facts of the history conflict with the reigning theoretical model, it may fall to non-academic writers to disseminate a more nuanced narrative. The danger with this, of course, is that many trade writers who frolic in the vineyard of history are not trained historians, and are liable to seize upon the ill-conceived or the sensational, a trap that has admittedly also snared a history professor or two. All this is meant only to express my sense of responsibility in handling a subject as multifaceted as Hawaiʻi. I knew going in that discussion and re-examination of how to interpret the island's history is in active ferment, but what I found was an intellectual community in near riot over control of the narrative. Revisionism, very often appropriate but sometimes excessive, provocative, and overreaching, is a given feature now of American history as presented in the Academy. Hawaiʻi, however, has placed the phenomenon in a pressure cooker, by its isolation from other fields of history, by the long suppression of the native culture, and the suddenness of a rich profusion of studies that incorporate it. Consequently, it is not unusual to find summaries of the American missionaries in Hawaiʻi that treat their presence as a foreign invasion. But it is incomplete and misleading to exclude mention of Opukahaʻia, or Hopu, or other refugees from the Kamehameha conquest, with their insistent challenges to the American Christian community to evangelize the islands and end the horrors of endless warfare and kapu, the ancient regimen of taboos. One history of the Chief's Children's School, apart from acknowledging that the enterprise was undertaken at the request of the ali'i, the noble class, treats it as a purely American, ethnocentric gutting of the native culture, and omits any mention of the scholarly John Papaʻiʻi, kahu of the king's niece and nephews, who functioned as a vice principal of the school, who appreciated the good that both cultures had to offer, and who was an important bridge from the old culture to the modern world. This debate over historical candor is hardly new. No sooner had Hawaiʻi's first printed chronicler, Samuel Manaiakalani Kamako, begun relating Ka Mo'olelo Hawaiʻi, the history of Hawaiʻi, in the Hawaiian language journal Ka Nupepa Kuokoa in June 1865, then he suffered robust criticism from readers who were offended that the knowledge was being imparted to those who had no permission to hear it. This subject is not acquired by the common people, huffed Una in an opinion editorial, nor by the country people. Only through the chiefs was it gained. In ancient times, this was a very sacred subject, never to be given to another. 3 years of research have chastened me with the sense that virtually nothing in Hawaiian history has a single cause, and virtually no one acted out of a single motivation. It is not a simple history, and it cannot be explained simply, certainly not with recourse to the easy remedies of a previous academic era, native savagery and simplicity, or of the current one, the Anglo sense of hegemony and entitlement. It is undeniable, for instance, that the arrival of Western venereal diseases decreased the natural fecundity of the islanders. But that does not, contrary to the impression one gets from museum displays, explain the expiration of the Kamehameha dynasty. Like Egyptian pharaohs, the ali'i had been preserving their mana, their spiritual force, by inbreeding for centuries. That probably was partly responsible for the fact that no Kamehameha after the conqueror sired any legitimate children who lived to adulthood. Similarly, that Queen Ka'ahumanu witnessed the failure of Kapu to prevent the decline of her people does explain, in part, her motivation to overthrow this ancient system of social control. It is also true that she adored power and had no intention of taking a back seat after the death of her husband, the conqueror. It is true, for another example, that the prudishness and Anglocentrism of the missionaries wrecked a complex and in many ways lovely indigenous culture. It is also true that some facets of that culture were savage. As constrained as one is today to treat the values of differing cultures with respect, some of the traditional Hawaiian practices, such as human sacrifice and infanticide, were savage. No other word serves. It is true that the missionaries did not have the foresight to let the benefits of education and incipient democracy leaven the native culture in their own way. It is also true that neither did any other colonizing culture of that or any preceding era. And even if they had, it is doubtful that an enlightened native culture would have survived late 19th century imperialism, whether American, British, Japanese, or anyone else's. But as one native minister was heard to complain, "America gave us the light, but now that we have the light, we should be left to use it for ourselves." If only that idea had caught on, the history and the lessons to draw from it might be radically different. But as it is, one website promoting Hawaiian tourism writes on its history page that it is difficult to find an objective Hawaiian history that is accurate and unemotional. My goal with this book is to make that a little less difficult. I should close with a word about native language sources. Hawaiian is a highly complex tongue that is not merely capable of great subtlety. It is a language in which subtlety is its daily stock in trade, with nuances of expression that escape the American voyagers and still lead Anglo scholars astray. Most words have multiple meanings. First, the literal meaning of the thing or action spoken, and then the kauna, the hidden meanings, either a spiritual overtone and or often a highly irreverent sexual raspberry or double entendre. Among the historical sources, one can consult, for instance, the reminiscences of John Papaʻiʻi, who was raised in the conqueror's court as a companion to his son and successor, Liholiho. Papaʻiʻi provided a highly illuminating look at royal circles until his death midway through the reign of Kamehameha V. However, one recent skillful study details the pitfalls of using the English translation of Papaʻiʻi's memoirs, which first became available in 1959. My general examination of the Americanization of Hawaiʻi for a mainland audience that mostly does not know the story at all may not be crucially dependent upon such sources, but I am wistful about how much better it would be had I a lifetime's facility in this language, whose gradations of meaning were honed by centuries of chant and high oratory. Written Hawaiian utilizes 12 letters plus the okina, the reversed apostrophe that indicates a glottal stop to break two syllables, or to begin a syllable with a closed throat, with a tiny cough, if you will. At the risk of provoking the impatience of a mainland audience, in this text I have opted to use the okina, not to be pedantic, but because it simplifies pronunciation for the mainland eye. The name, for instance, of the sister of King Kamehameha III, whom he desperately desired to marry, Nahiʻenaʻena, is a confusing mouthful unless broken down as Nahiʻenaʻena. Similarly, without the okina, virtually all mainlanders would misread the name of the crater Halemaumau. It is pronounced Halemaumau. Absent the okina, however, paired vowels are indeed pronounced as a diphthong, but with more attention to the vowel's individual sounds than in English, as in hana'una'o. The Western eye is also accustomed to reading double vowels in a standard way that would be incorrect in Hawaiian, hence the utility of the okina in references to the Ko'olau mountain range or the island of Kaho'olawe, or names such as Princess Ruth Ke'elikolani. Finally, standard current usage has developed no fixed rules on which form of a word or name to use when it changed with the adoption of an alphabet. Before the language was standardized, the unifying conqueror king of the islands, Kamehameha, was almost always referred to, and his documents were subscribed, Tamehameha. This form was used by his son Liholiho, or Riho in the old style, as Tamehameha II, and then by Liholiho's younger brother as Tamehameha III. The K that replaced T with the adoption of the alphabet is now universally backdated to the beginning, and one reads of Kamehameha from the arrival of Captain Cook. The same is true of Kamehameha's rival, Kaumo'ali'i, the king of Kauai. Before the substitution of K and L, he is referred to most often as Tamori. And there was a small fishing village on the south shore of Oahu that was called Honolulu until L took the place of R, but is now referred to as Honolulu from the beginning. Contrary to this, taro, the starchy food staple brought from Lower Polynesia by the first settlers, became kalo after the language was standardized, but modern usage has continued to use the archaic form. Similarly, Princess Ruth Ke'elikolani saw her name modify from Ruth to Luka after the alphabet was adopted, and she is so referred to in correspondence among the royal family, but the newer iteration is never seen in modern print, a fate opposite to that of Kamehameha the Conqueror, her great-grandfather. My goal has been to confuse people as little as possible, and I have followed these established practices. In cases where a person's name changed significantly, Lydia Kamakaeha Paki did not become Princess Liliuokalani until her brother became king, although Elizabeth Kinau gave her elements of the name at her birth. A brief phrase in the text suffices to tip off the reader that this person has a significant future role to play. Antecedent: Captain Cook. On January 18, 1778, Captain James Cook, Royal Navy, strode the quarterdeck of his vessel of exploration, the converted collier HMS Resolution. She was stocky and slow, 460 tons. With a 30-foot beam across a 93-foot keel, she was a third wide as she was long, like sailing a great rectangular box. But she was over-engineered, built to weather an epic voyage and withstand almost any challenge to her construction. Cook had pronounced her the fittest ship for service that he had seen, and if there was one kind of vessel on Earth that James Cook knew how to handle, it was a collier, a coal carrier. The legendary Captain Cook had just turned 50, with penetrating blue eyes set in a taut, angular face. On his last visit home, he found himself such a celebrity that his likeness was painted by the great Nathaniel Dance. Unlike most of the serene portraiture of this era, dominated by the paintings of Thomas Gainsborough and Joshua Reynolds, with their subjects often recumbent in gardens of classical statuary, Cook was shown seated at a table, leaning forward, pointing to a speck on a map, his head cocked to one side, and with the glint in his eye of a man possessed. Indeed, his life story had been one of dissatisfaction and hurry. Unhappy on his parents' farm, and unhappy as a grocery clerk when he was apprenticed out at 16, he was apprenticed again to coal merchants in Whitby, and first went to sea on one of their colliers. While still a teenager, he devoured in his off-duty hours the study of astronomy, navigation, and mathematics, and by 24 he attained the rating of mate. He gained his own merchant command at 27, of another collier working the Baltic Sea, but joined the Royal Navy in June of 1755, once it was apparent that England and France were headed for a fight. As a junior officer in the 7 Years' War, known in America as the French and Indian War, he took part in numerous sea battles, sat successfully for his master's examination in 1757, and then in 1759 proved instrumental in winning Canada for Britain. Showing early his skill at cartography, as master of HMS Pembroke, he charted the shore of the St. Lawrence River, piloting General James Wolfe and his army to a landing from which they scaled the heights and surprised the French on the Plains of Abraham, leading to the capture of Quebec. This, and then his 3 years mapping the entire coast of Newfoundland with punctilious accuracy, marked him as an officer of singular determination and ability. After the war, the Royal Society, in full the Royal Society of London for Improving Natural Knowledge, with its century of exploration and scientific quest already accomplished, desired to mount an expedition to Tahiti to observe the expected transit of Venus across the sun. After a canvass of the Royal Navy for its best navigator and mapmaker, it was Cook, who was promoted to lieutenant and seconded to the Royal Society. In a momentous 3-year voyage, he delivered his onboard astronomer to Tahiti to have his gaze at Venus, and then sailed west, circumnavigated and mapped the coast of New Zealand, and explored the eastern coast of Australia. He returned home in July 1771 with thousands of botanical specimens, journals that were published to wide fascination, and claim to a vast South Seas addition to the British Empire. Although the Royal Society did not know much more about Venus than it had before, Cook was lionized for his exploration, promoted to commander, and offered another mighty journey. The ignorance of the West concerning the undiscovered regions was as massive as it was opaque. The most knowledgeable geographers for years had postulated the existence of a great southern continent, a terra australis, a mighty landmass that must fill the far southern Pacific to counterbalance the weight of Asia. Otherwise, the planet must wobble out of its orbit. In his second voyage, Cook's commission was to discover terra australis and claim it for the Empire. From 1772 to 1775, Cook pursued the goal, running a vast search pattern in the open waters of the Southern Ocean, becoming the first mariner to cross the Antarctic Circle. But in the 6,000 miles west to east of the Southern Pacific, traversed not once but twice, he proved that there was no terra australis. When he was back home again, the geographers would not have it, but Cook left them to grapple with the Earth's rotation as best they could. He had been there, and he knew better. Cook was brusquely thanked with the Copley Gold Medal and made a Fellow of the Royal Society. Then he was retired from active service and given a post at Greenwich Hospital. It was a retirement that he did not want, and Cook found a way to fight it. Over the years, he had acquired the friendship and the patronage of the formidable John Montagu, the 4th Earl of Sandwich, a man of sobering means and weighty influence who, since the end of Cook's first voyage, had acted as First Lord of the Admiralty. Cook knew him also as a man of vision. His later reputation for incompetence was overwritten by historians, and Sandwich offered him a third commission that would dwarf the others in importance. Almost from the time that Columbus had proved that the world was round, the holy grail of navigation had been to discover the Northwest Passage, a sea route that must lie to the north of the New World. It would link Europe and the Orient by a voyage a fraction of the distance required by rounding the tip of Africa and crossing the Indian Ocean. All who had attempted to descry it failed, crossing the Atlantic only to be frustrated by the maze of icy islands in the Canadian Arctic. But no one had tried to find it from the west. The Bering Strait was known, separating Siberia from Alaska, but what lay north and east of there? That breathtaking task was handed to Cook, but no one must know. None of the competitors in the scramble for imperial expansion, the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, and now above all the Russians, for the Bering Strait was their back door, must have any inkling of the reason for Cook's heading to sea once more. It was put out for public consumption that the purpose of this third voyage was to return a native Tahitian named Hawaiʻi to his home. This first South Sea Islander to visit the West had accompanied Cook to England, had been the toast of London, and now gave convenient cover for the third voyage. Cook was promoted again to captain, commanding the stout Resolution, and accompanied by a second ex-collier, half the size of the Resolution, HMS Discovery, Captain Charles Clark commanding. Leaving Omahe